Okay.
Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 440. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to have you back on this week. Got a lot to talk about. Just want to remind people to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, but we do repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. Video version is at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee. So be sure you subscribe to one of those. And then if you just want the audio only, you listen on your drive or something like that. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. If you've been listening for a while, recommend the show. If you're, kind of new to the show, just make sure you're subscribing to it somewhere so you don't miss episodes. And Connor, with that, let's get into the news today. First story up here. This is the Russian foreign minister saying the U.S. and Russia are in a fight of worlds. The Kremlin's top diplomat said Moscow can no longer trust Washington and the potential for nuclear war has escalated. The Russian foreign minister suggested that talks with American officials were possible, but Washington has not made an effort to engage. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's remarks were reported in TASS on Wednesday. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly that if we were open for cooperation, but in regards to our former Western partners, we can no longer rely on agreements with them, including legally binding ones. It is a fight of worlds of sorts. He went on to indicate that talks between the two sides are unlikely. Each time U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken requested contact, it happened twice in the last 18 months. I think I either answered his phone call or we talked on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali for about 10 minutes, but there were no more requests. He said that contacts between the White House and the Kremlin have been through National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan rather than Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And Connor, I'm not quite sure if this is good or bad news because Blinken is such a hawk. Usually you would assume you will want the Secretary of State handling the diplomacy, but in this case, Sullivan's probably not better, but he might not be worse either. Lavrov argued that part of the issue is Western leaders have stated they will indefinitely provide military aid to Ukraine. They never answered the question, what it takes to do what. It is to end the military campaign like it ended in Afghanistan or Iraq, he explained. And then he added, it is possible a slightly different thing if they want to use this campaign to completely annihilate the Ukrainian army. That is, when they smelled trouble in Afghanistan and Iraq, they simply hightailed it out of there. They have no interest in Ukraine itself. And Connor, comparing it to the Iraq war is interesting, of course, as Joe Biden had a couple of gaffes this week, confusing Iraq and Ukraine. But also, in this case, Lavrov is wrong, and the U.S. still is in Iraq. We haven't hightailed it out of there yet, unfortunately. The diplomat said Moscow has no plans to conclude the war before achieving its goals in Ukraine. The Wagner insurrection and the Wagner insurrection had no major battlefield impacts. As we overcame the attempted mutiny, we haven't made the slightest concession with respect to the goals of the special military operation and haven't lost any positions on the battlefield. It's important not to give them up the goals that have been set. And Connor, I was speculating that maybe Russia would lose some territory, but it doesn't seem like there really hasn't been any significant battlefield shift, at least as of yet. And there's a pretty good article today in the Quincy Institute where the author explains that this, somewhat resembles the strength or shows the strength of the Russian military because there may have been a point in this war where especially without the Wagner forces, they couldn't withstand the Ukrainian offensive. But at this point, they do seem to have, developed tactics, trainings, and have really stabilized their positions on the battlefield. And so, to wrap up here, Lavrov warned the deteriorating relationship between Washington and Moscow escalate the risk of a nuclear war, blaming the U.S. from withdrawing from Cold War agreements. It is a medical fact that they have destroyed the entire international legal system of deterrence and strategic stability. It is a good thing they do not want nuclear war. No one wants it. And the system of agreements which has been destroyed by the United States still existed specifically to reduce its risk and to make this risk negligible at all. So, he's warning Connor that this could get worse. And since the end of the Cold War, Washington has withdrawn from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, while Moscow would suspended its participation in the New START agreement earlier this year. All right, so let's talk about Washington's support for Kiev here. Connor, U.S. announces $500 million weapons package for Ukraine. The Biden administration on Tuesday announced a new $500 million military aid package for Ukraine that included Bradleys and Stryker armored vehicles and ammunition for various weapons. And according to the Pentagon, this is a very long list of the new munitions. So here it is. Additional munitions for Patriot air defense systems, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, additional ammunition for HIMARS, demolition munitions and systems for obstacle clearing, mine clearing equipment, 105 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 30 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 25 Stryker armored personnel carriers, 2 launched optically tracked wire-guided tow missiles, Javelin anti-armor systems, AT-4 anti-armor systems, anti-armor rockets, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARMS, precision aerial munitions, small arms and over 22 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenade, thermal imaging system and night vision devices, testing and diagnostics equipment to support vehicle maintenance and repair, spare parts generators, and other field equipment. So we have quite a substantial list there in this current aid package. And we also have, Connor, the whole pretext here of the war in Ukraine is that we had to fight to defend Ukraine's borders and establish Ukraine's democracy and defend Ukraine's democracy. And here we have Dave DeCamp reporting that Zelensky says there will be no elections in Ukraine until the war is over. And so in a way, Connor, I guess this is not unsurprising, but this is Zelensky essentially declaring himself the dictator of Ukraine. Martial law has been declared. He's waging a culture war in his country, an information war in his country. He has nationalized the media. And so to say that the Ukrainian people won't have any referendum over their country's leadership, until this war is over. And I do understand for some people who are saying, well, it's difficult to have an election when another country occupies 20% of your country. And while, there is some truth to that, Zelensky, again, just usurping this power is very concerning. And the American people should, take note, because, again, what we're saying we're doing is defending Ukrainian democracy. So along with the war in Ukraine, Connor, NATO really wanted to beef up its military presence in Eastern Europe. And we have the U.S. State Department furthering that goal, approving a $15 billion arms sale to Poland. I wrote this up for the Libertarian Institute. The State Department announced it authorized selling $15 billion in advanced air defense systems to Poland. The deal comes as Washington wants to increase NATO's military presence in Eastern Europe. A press release distributed by the State Department on Wednesday says this processed sale will support the foreign policy goals and national security objectives of the United States by improving the security of a NATO ally, that is, force and political stability and economic progress in Europe. The U.S. and NATO leaders argue the alliance must build up its military presence in countries that border Russia. Russia continues to deter in order to deter Russian President Vladimir Putin's desire to expand his nation's borders. However, Moscow has not indicated any plans to expand its borders beyond eastern Ukraine, where the Russian military has struggled to secure territory annexed by the Kremlin. The sale is for an estimated $15 billion in Patriot air defense systems, radars, and communications equipment. The primary contractors are Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Raytheon has been accused of price gouging by the Pentagon for Patriot interceptors, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was previously a board member at the arms manufacturer. After Russia invaded Ukraine last year, Washington and Brussels demanded NATO members increase military spending. The increase in defense budgets has been a boon for the weapons industry in the U.S. All right, Connor, just a couple of updates here on the Wagner Rebellion or insurrection, whatever we're wanting to call it here. And the New York Times says U.S. officials So the New York Times says U.S. officials claim Russian general knew about Prigozhin's rebellion plans. U.S. officials speaking to the New York Times said Wednesday that a senior Russian general knew of Prigozhin's plans for an uprising, a claim dismissed by the Kremlin. The U.S. officials claimed that the intelligence showed Sergei Shervokin, commander of the Russian Aerospace Forces and deputy commander of the Russian war effort in Ukraine, had knowledge of Prigozhin's plans. The officials said they were trying to figure out if he helped Prigozhin. It is possible he and other Russian military officials knew Prigozhin was plotting something due to the frequent tirades against the Russian military establishment, but does not mean they were involved. He issued an appeal to Prigozhin calling for an end to the rebellion after it started. And then one more here, we have the NATO chief saying members will defend themselves from Wagner fighters in Belarus. And Connor, I wonder, we talked on the last show about Germany agreeing to put some troops in Lithuania. And I kind of wonder if maybe Germany finally broke and agreed to do that because Prigozhin moved to Belarus, and there's claims there's going to be a major military buildup there. It was interesting. Initially, I saw these claims from people I would consider maybe pro-Russian, and I dismissed them on the show, and now they're being picked up by people who I definitely know are pro-NATO and pro-Empire as saying, we need a larger military buildup in Eastern Europe. And then, Connor, it really now does not look like Sweden will be joining NATO at the upcoming summit. I do think this is good news, although, I'm not for countries feuding or book burning or anything like that. But the Swedish government has issued a permit for Quran burning protests and a couple months ago, maybe, but it was, definitely this spring. Sweden had a Quran burning outside of the Turkish embassy. I think there's probably a lot of resentment in Sweden for Turkey because of the concessions that Erdogan, the Turkish leader, has demanded from the Swedish government. And this really, really irritated Ankara. And it was one of the reasons that they were not going to admit Sweden into the alliance. And so I can only imagine holding another Quran burning so close to the Lithuania summit here, just starting in probably a week and a half, 2 weeks in Vilnius, makes that seem pretty unlikely. And with that, Connor, I'm going to hand this over to you. You got a great article here that you wrote for the Libertarian Institute yesterday.
Yeah, so this is about Switzerland vetoing a plan to export almost 100 tanks, Leopard 1 German-made tanks, to Kiev, citing their long-held neutral status. So as I write, in a move which will surely garner censures from Bern's European allies, Switzerland has vetoed a plan to send roughly 100 mothballed German-made Leopard 1 battle tanks to Kiev, citing its neutrality laws. The decision comes as Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive, of course, has netted substantial losses in armored vehicles and no significant territorial gains. We have the Swiss arms maker RUAG AG requesting a license earlier this year to sell the 96 non-operational tanks that are stored in Italy to Germany's Rheinmetall. And the tanks would have then been refurbished and sent to Ukraine with Berlin's support. 7 years ago, these tanks were procured from the Italian military as part of a private transaction with RUAG. So the Swiss government made clear that the proposed transaction would be, quote, inconsistent with applicable law. And so Bern has come under criticism from its allies in Europe who want the Alpine nation to support Kiev's war effort, including allegations that it's maintaining an overly restrictive interpretation of its long-held and cherished neutrality policy. So on Wednesday, Switzerland's Federal Council, the 7-person executive arm of the Swiss Confederation, declared it has concluded, quote, has concluded that the sale of the 96 tanks is not possible under Swiss law as it stands. In particular, such a sale would contravene the War Material Act and would result in a shift from Switzerland's policy of neutrality. So Financial Times described this announcement as consistent with the Council's previous rulings, but that this is the single most consequential veto in terms of lost military potential for Ukraine that Bern has wielded. And Washington and its partners, including the Germans, have been pressuring Bern over its lack of material support for Ukraine's proxy war with Russia. In March, U.S. Ambassador to Switzerland Scott Miller warned that as a result of its intransigence, the country faces a dire political crisis. And the French ambassador also lashed out, saying Switzerland's stance constitutes a problem for Europe. Last fall, Switzerland adamantly refused to give Germany its required permission to provide Kiev with these outmoded Swiss-made anti-aircraft rounds, which are held in Germany's military stocks. Opinion polls, according to the Financial Times, there have been some polls that are coming out that are showing that a majority of voters in Switzerland do favor a more lenient policy, which would permit Swiss-owned weapons to be donated to Kiev for its war with Russia. And there are some members of parliament in both houses who are looking for ways to circumvent or adjust the existing laws to make it a bit easier. And on the federal council, we have the Swiss defense minister promoting a change in policy as well, but he's at odds with his colleagues there. And the Swiss president, who's also a member of the federal council, his name is Alain Berset, has strongly denounced any of these efforts to send Kiev arms for the war, proclaiming that warfare is not part of the Swiss DNA. And so just one thing to point out, as Bloomberg noted, the announcement on Wednesday is unconnected to a separate sale of 25 Leopard 2 tanks that belong to the Swiss Army, which are supposed to go to the German company Rheinmetall AG. But this deal recently won the support of the Swiss government and is expected to go through next year. But importantly, Germany has promised not to send those tanks to Ukraine, but to keep them at home to fill gaps in its own military. And of course, we had the German defense minister recently tell the Ukrainian, I believe it was the deputy defense minister, who was saying, oh, come on, you can send 3 times as many of the Leopard 2 tanks as you've sent to us already, and we need them because we're losing them in the counteroffensive. And the Germans said that we're not going to be able to replace all of the Leopard tanks that you're losing. So they're looking at Switzerland to do it, and thankfully they're holding to their policy of at least not getting involved in materially supporting Ukraine in the war. They have condemned Russia's invasion, and they're trying to maintain their economic ties with the West. I believe they've frozen some Russian assets as well, but they're essentially trying to walk a fine line by holding to their principles that they've historically held and not getting involved in these major wars, and at the same time keep a good reputation with their European allies. And so we'll see. But it does say that things are the implication in the Financial Times piece was that politically the winds are changing, but it's at a slow pace. So hopefully, I just would hope that they stick to their the status quo. Okay. So this next story is about North Korea, and I wrote this on June 15th for the Institute. This is North Korea launches 2 ballistic missiles in response to massive U.S.-South Korean war drills. So in keeping with Biden's trend of launching the largest ever war drills with all these myriad allies, whether it's South Korea or Israel or the Philippines or Australia. So here we go. This is with South Korea, very close to the border with the DMZ, rehearsing for regime change and war with North Korea. So North Korea launched 2 ballistic missiles toward its eastern waters in what was described as a grave provocation on Thursday by this is according to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff. So and this is again from the 15th when I wrote this. So if I'm saying certain days, apologies. It's just we're catching up here. So the short-range missile launches followed the 5th and final round of Washington and Seoul's largest ever combined live-fire joint military exercises. Now, according to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff, North Korea's missiles were launched from Pyongyang and traveled roughly 480 miles. The missiles then landed in the sea between Japan and the Korean Peninsula within Tokyo's exclusive economic zone, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said. Commemorating the 70th anniversary of the 2 countries' alliance, the just concluded U.S.-South Korean combined annihilation firepower drills were the largest of their kind since they were first held in 1977. South Korea's defense ministry explained that each of the 5 rounds involved quote, 2,500 South Korean and U.S. troops and about 610 military assets, including stealth fighter jets, attack helicopters, tanks, and drones from both countries. And of course, Pyongyang views these massive war simulations on its doorstep as invasion rehearsals. Some of these exercises included simulated, quote, artillery and aerial strikes on frontline North Korean military facilities and took place only about 16 miles south of the DMZ. State media in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea accused Washington and Seoul of using the drills to master, quote, military threat and blackmail and war tactics against North Korea. And hours after the drills wrapped up, Pyongyang launched the two missiles. Additionally, 30 minutes before firing these missiles, North Korea's military vowed an unspecified, quote, inevitable response to Washington's drills with its neighbor, which it denounced as provocative and irresponsible. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol declared that, quote, only a strong military which can fight and defeat the enemy and which the enemy can't even dare to challenge can guarantee the freedom, peace, and prosperity of the Republic of Korea. Yoon observed the drills alongside senior South Korean and U.S. military officials. So then we had National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reaffirming Washington's commitment to the defense of South Korea and Japan, and during a meeting with officials from the three countries in Tokyo, and this is according to a White House statement. And the officials were said to have discussed North Korea as well as coordination tactics in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, where the U.S. has been carrying out a vast military buildup against China for more than a decade. So it always bears repeating that after a years-long pause, the Joe Biden administration resumed large-scale war games targeting the DPRK. And as a result, since 2022, Pyongyang has launched over 100 missiles. And earlier this year, Washington and Seoul carried out their largest live-fire field exercises in 5 years. The drills were dubbed Faux Eagle. And concurrently, the Pentagon sent MQ-9 Reaper armed drones to the Korean Peninsula for the first time. The nuclear-powered USS Nimitz aircraft carrier, as well as nuclear-capable bombers, have also participated in joint exercises with South Korea this year. Last month, during a meeting with Yoon, Biden promised the U.S. would periodically dock U.S. nuclear-armed submarines in South Korea. And last year, Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul entered a trilateral defense agreement eyeing Pyongyang and Beijing. At the time, North Korea referred to this pact as a, quote, Asian version of NATO. Now, ancillary to the Pentagon's pivot to Asia, the encirclement of China, Japan announced it would double its military budget over 5 years and increase military cooperation with the U.S. So the Biden administration's North Korea policy is far more hawkish than the status quo during the last half of the Donald Trump administration, wherein war games were rolled back, dialogue was opened, and all sides reduced weapons tests. Tensions are soaring on the Korean Peninsula as the crippling sanctions have been maintained indefinitely, and U.S. officials have threatened North Korea with obliteration. And Biden has offered no off-ramp for Pyongyang, only demanding that the country agree to its own denuclearization and disarmament. Okay, so then on the 28th, this week, I wrote up a story about a new national intelligence estimate about the so-called North Korean threat as it pertains to their nuclear weapons. And so this is U.S. intel community hypes North Korean nuke threat, concedes Pyongyang will not use weapons for offensive purposes. And again, this is from the 28th. So a national intelligence estimate written in January, which discusses Pyongyang's nuclear weapons policy for the remainder of this decade, was declassified by the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, earlier this month. So the document looks at a variety of potential scenarios and concludes that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea will continue to use its nuclear weapons status, not for offensive military purposes, but as a way of coercively accomplishing some political objectives. So declassified on June 15th, the NIE is titled North Korea Scenarios for Leveraging Nuclear Weapons Through 2030. And so in the document, the intelligence community lays out three possible values North Korean leader Kim Jong-un could ascribe to his weapons and how to use them during the next 7 years, namely for coercive, offensive, or defensive purposes. And Kim will use his arsenal to support coercive diplomacy, the paper insists. out of these three different options. And so, in the most likely scenario, Kim, quote, employs threats, including nuclear threats and possibly limited use of military force, to achieve political objectives while maintaining escalation control and trying to minimize the regime threatening retaliation. The North's nuclear weapons serve as a deterrent to a U.S. South Korea response to such actions. And this is a very skewed way of looking at things, but so we get into that in a moment. But Kim is said to be more likely to employ this strategy as opposed to its two alternatives because the North Korean president is more certain he can yield some military, economic, and political benefits, while the risk of economic blowback, as they put it, is also lessened. So, per the National Intelligence Estimate, this is especially true when compared to a hypothetical and decidedly unlikely, quote, offensive strategy which Kim could hypothetically employ, such as using his arsenal to split off Washington from Seoul in an attempt to achieve military and political dominance over the Korean Peninsula. But that's certainly not going to happen, and they admit that. So, summarizing the intelligence community's assessment, the NIE states, we assess that through 2030, Kim Jong-un most likely will continue to pursue a strategy of coercion, potentially including non-nuclear lethal attacks aimed at advancing the North's goals of intimidating its neighbors, extracting concessions, and bolstering the regime's military credentials domestically. Kim has relied largely on non-lethal coercive measures throughout his rule, they say. So, though the document makes no mention of Kim's motives, he has increased these missile launches, as we were just discussing, utilizing the putatively coercive strategy in an attempt to back the White House off from its extremely aggressive and hostile policy against his country. And as a control for that, we can look at the last half of the Trump administration to see that U.S. policy very much has an effect on North Korean military policy in the region. And that they are reacting to the U.S. building up for war on their borders and simulating the destruction of their country and the decapitation of their regime constantly and making all these threats. And of course, this is all happening amidst this seemingly perpetual economic war. So, last week, we had a guided missile submarine, the USS Michigan, dock in Busan, South Korea, as a, quote, dress rehearsal for the upcoming deployment of a nuclear-armed U.S. submarine. And as I mentioned earlier, Biden has pledged that the U.S. will periodically dock these submarines armed with nuclear weapons on the peninsula. And this, of course, can only serve as a massive provocation. So just another example of how, despite the fact that they know that Kim does not want to use nukes for offensive purposes, for military purposes, he's using them for leverage and diplomacy. They just refuse to engage in diplomacy. And of course, the buildup against China has horrible effects in terms of the relationship between the South Koreans and the North Koreans. And we have a much more hawkish president in South Korea now than his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, who is trying to officially end the war and make peace on the peninsula. But there's no partner for that, of course, in the White House, nor in power in South Korea right now. So we're just continually encircling North Korea, also encircling China, but it's easier to say that we're just reacting to Kim and his madness and his nuclear threat, when really this is just another example of Biden being just unapologetically aggressive and bellicose and militaristic without any other off-ramp, without any even pretense of diplomacy or engagement or negotiation. It's just war fever. Okay, so now, speaking of that, because it does seem like there's some better news here on the Iran front than usual, we're going to catch up. Dave DeCamp has been covering the most recent developments here with the potential interim deal with the U.S. and Iran. So this one's from the 15th. State Department says reports on potential U.S.-Iran agreement not true. So the State Department this was a couple of Thursdays ago, said reports of a potential agreement between the U.S. and Iran related to Iran's nuclear program are not true. With respect to Iran's nuclear program, there is no deal. The reports that there is a deal or some agreement or some other description, however you want to describe it, are not true, State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said. Now, Miller's comments come after multiple media outlets have reported that the U.S. and Iran are close to a deal that would involve Iran pledging not to increase uranium enrichment beyond 60% in exchange for access to frozen Iranian funds in the International Monetary Fund, South Korea, Iraq, etc. So the two sides are also reportedly discussing a potential prisoner swap. And on Wednesday, the New York Times, this was a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times quoted an Iranian official who called the potential deal a, quote, political ceasefire to reduce soaring tensions between the two countries. And we had Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tell the Israeli Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee around that time that the U.S. and Iran might be reaching a, quote, mini agreement. And he's changed his position on this. We'll get to that in a moment. But at the time, Netanyahu was saying that might be something we can live with, or at least it was reported in Israeli TV and other Israeli media that he also said that during this meeting. Now, Iran has confirmed that it held indirect negotiations with the U.S. in the Omani capital of Muscat in recent months. Oman's foreign minister said that the two sides are close to finalizing an agreement on Americans who are being held in Tehran, and said that there was a, quote, seriousness to also reach a deal on Iran's civilian nuclear program. Now, despite the deluge of reports and signs that the two sides are working out an agreement, the Biden administration continues to deny it, possibly due to pressure from Iran hawks in Congress, which, of course, they're just proliferating in both parties. I'm not sure who Biden's more concerned about, to be honest, but probably the Republicans. The next story here, Western officials says U.S. goal in deal with Iran is to avoid an Israeli attack. And I think the most important story that came up about this, Trita Parsi has been so great on this, but I think he's interviewed quite a bit in this piece by Ken Klippenstein in The Intercept, which is about how there were documents apparently in the Teixeira leaks, the Discord leaks, that showed that the CIA was actually getting a bit antsy. They didn't know if Netanyahu was just blowing smoke as usual, or if the Israelis seriously were considering attacking Iran and starting a war, which would, of course, immediately involve the U.S. So I suspected that one of the reasons why they were doing this and trying to ease tensions here was to take that off the table as much as possible, because, as Trita has pointed out, the Biden administration has taken a drastically more hawkish position on Iran, even compared to Trump or George W. Bush, for the simple fact that what they've done, what Jake Sullivan and what Joe Biden have done, among other officials, Tom Nides, the ambassador to Israel, have done, is they've said unequivocally that Israel can do whatever they want to Iran. They can attack Iran. They can continue to conduct these sabotage attacks. But, well, the implication is that, continue whatever you want with the drone strikes and the assassinations and the sabotage attacks. But if you want to attack them like overtly, we got your back and we think you're in the right. And so that is the kind of thing that certainly that Obama would not have done. And Trita always cites an example where Biden pretty much explicitly said that was American policy, I believe back in 2009, and Obama had to come out and personally walk it back. It was a very big deal. And then, even Trump wouldn't go that far. And so they have to reel that back in some way because, of course, Netanyahu is facing all this internal political turmoil as a result of his planned judicial overhaul and his corruption trial, and he's been bombing his neighbors left and right. So here we have an unnamed Western official speaking to Reuters saying that one of America's main objectives in recently engaging with Iran and reaching some sort of agreement on the nuclear program is to prevent an Israeli attack on the Islamic Republic. So the official says that if the Iranians miscalculate, the potential for a strong Israeli response is something that we want to avoid. So far, the U.S. has denied that any deal with Iran is in the works, but Iran has confirmed indirect negotiations have recently taken place in Oman, And there's been this flood of media reports saying that an agreement between the two sides is close. And the Reuters report said the U.S. wants to portray the potential deal as a, quote, understanding rather than an agreement that would need congressional approval. The majority of Congress is very hawkish on Iran and would likely oppose any formal deal. A potential understanding that's on the table would involve Iran either ceasing 60% uranium enrichment or vowing not to go above that level in exchange for access to frozen funds or more general sanctions relief. There was also discussion of them being permitted to export 1 million barrels of oil per day. So that could also be ancillary to this. Now, the U.S. is also looking to secure the release of Americans detained in Tehran. While Israel is always sounding the alarm about Iran's nuclear program, it's opposed to agreements that would restrict Tehran's uranium enrichment. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Sunday that Israel opposed to any mini agreement between the U.S. and Iran. So walking back that previous claim, or at least the reporting of that previous claim. Now, despite Israel's claims there's no sign Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon, as it has never enriched uranium at the 90% level needed for weapons grade. Iran has also been very cooperative with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear watchdog, recently, unlike Israel, which has a secret nuclear weapons program and is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whereas Iran has been for more than 50 years. Okay, now, again, this looks like the Abraham's Accord, more signs that the Abraham Accords and the complementary build-up for a mini NATO-style alliance against Iran, is that whole strategy appears to be falling apart here further and further. This is from Dave DeCamp on the 20th. Saudi Arabia signals an openness to naval alliance with Iran. So Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan met with his Iranian counterpart in Tehran on, this would have been last Saturday or so, and signaled that Riyadh is open to a naval alliance with Tehran, an idea recently put forward by Iran's Navy chief. So this is Hussein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian, this is Prince Faisal bin Farhan at a joint press conference with his Iranian counterpart, Hussein Amir Abdollahian. And so Prince Faisal says, I would like to point out the importance of cooperation between our two countries concerning the regional security, especially the security of maritime navigation and waterways. So Iranian Navy Commander Shahram Irani said earlier this month that Iran was working to form a naval alliance with regional countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Iraq. And the potential maritime coalition goes against U.S. and Israeli plans for the region, which involve forming an anti-Iran alliance between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. And of course, the UAE and Bahrain are two of the signatories to the Abraham Accords. So this will get very interesting here soon. And we have Amir Abdollahian saying that Saturday the two foreign ministers discussed increasing cooperation in all areas, including security. And he stressed that Iran's view is that regional security will be ensured by regional actors only, without external interference, a clear reference to the United States. Now, the increased cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia comes after the Beijing brokered deal that saw the two nations normalize diplomatic relations, which had been suspended back in 2016. Prince Faisal said our relations are based on a clear foundation of full and mutual respect for independence, sovereignty, and non-interference in internal affairs. Okay. Now, the last story here is about Jake Sullivan having an apparently direct talk with Shaki Hanegbi, his Israeli counterpart, about Netanyahu and the Israelis leaking information about this interim deal, mini agreement, so to speak, that the U.S. and Iran are working toward. So this is from the 28th. Dave writes, Axios reported on Wednesday that the White House National Security Axios reported on Wednesday that the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed concern to his Israeli counterpart about Israel leaking information to the press about the U.S. and Iran holding indirect talks to reach an interim agreement on Tehran's nuclear program. Now, Iran has publicly confirmed that it held indirect talks with the U.S. and Oman, but the Biden administration has not. The administration also denied reports that said that the U.S. and Iran were close to an agreement for Tehran to reduce uranium enrichment levels in exchange for some sanctions relief and this potential prisoner swap. But Israeli officials were speaking openly about the potential agreement. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Knesset lawmakers that the U.S. and Iran were working on a mini agreement. Citing unnamed U.S. and Israeli officials, the Axios report said that Sullivan and Israeli National Security Advisor Shaki Hanegbi, who's a huge Iran hawk, former Likudnik settlement minister, he made threats in 2020 and then also last December when Netanyahu came back into power that if Biden even thinks about returning to the JCPOA, Netanyahu will attack Iran and start a war. And so they're saying that that the two national security advisors had a, quote, tough call last week about Israel leaking the information. And Israeli officials said that Sullivan expressed frustration about Netanyahu's remarks. The Biden administration has tried to stay quiet about the potential deal with Iran because the Iran hawks in Congress, which include most Republicans and some Democrats, would oppose any agreement with the Islamic Republic, particularly if it involves sanctions relief. A Western official previously told Reuters that one reason for Washington seeking an agreement with Tehran is to prevent this Israeli attack on the Islamic Republic. Israeli officials are constantly threatening Iran over its nuclear program, but of course, they're the most adamantly opposed to things like the JCPOA, the most stringent nuclear inspection, comprehensive nuclear inspections regime ever implemented by the IAEA. So just on its face, it's ludicrous. It's just about having an enemy that can justify the unconditional aid to Israel from Washington. And despite Israeli claims, there's no sign that Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon, something the Pentagon acknowledged in its nuclear posture review that was issued last year, as well as the National Defense Strategy. Iran is currently enriching some uranium at 60%, but they've never attempted to enrich at the 90% level needed for weapons grade. And the Iranians have pledged, at least since 2021, after they raised their enrichment for the uranium hexafluoride to 60% in response to these Israeli attacks on their nuclear program, particularly at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility. It's the main center for building centrifuges, excuse me. But they've pledged that they're never going to exceed 60%. So, and I think the Americans know that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making this deal. I think it's just a way to get, as we said, the Israeli attack off the table, because they must be concerned that Netanyahu is going to do something very drastic to just kind of protect himself politically with all the chaos right now that he's created for himself. So that's the update for today. We'll be back with some more stuff on Israel and the West Bank next week.
All right, Connor. Thanks for the update. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back with more shows next week.